Hi, I'm Professor Helen Smith. Welcome to Thin Ice Press and welcome to this event at the York Festival of Ideas. I'm a Professor of Renaissance Literature and with JT Welsh, who you'll meet shortly, I'm the co-founder of Thin Ice Press. I'm delighted to welcome this evening one of our former students as well, and now a very successful academic in her own right, who will be speaking to you shortly about the horizons of print. So a few technical notes just before we begin. If you're watching live, you can ask questions using the Q&A button on your screen. And please feel free to pop questions in at any stage during the evening. We'll take a look at those. And if there's anything that we don't have time to answer now, we'll still be really grateful to have your thoughts, your reactions, and your responses to what we're up to here and to Georgina's fascinating talk. If you do have any technical issues, including loss of Wi-Fi, you should be able to just rejoin the event using the original link. And please remember too that this event is being recorded so that you can watch it again and come back to it at any moment when you want to see what we're up to and remind yourselves of this evening's entertainment or event. There are subtitles available in the event, and to turn them on or off, please just use the CC live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. So it's a huge pleasure to introduce our speaker who will take us through the first part of this evening. The way the event will run is that we'll have a short talk from Georgina Wilson, and then we'll give you a very little tour of Thin Ice Press, which you see here standing in the press just at the moment, and then there'll be plenty of time for question and answers at the end of the session. Georgina Wilson is a research fellow at Fitzwilliam College, Cambridge. Her research asks what kind of objects books are and have been, and why this matters for how we read. And her PhD, for which she studied at the University of Oxford, is called Paperscapes, Navigating Books in Early Modern England. It's going to make an absolutely fantastic book, a monograph in short order. So the project that she worked on there is interested in how the papery forms of printed texts travelled around the book, the city, the library, and even the globe, both in reality and in people's imaginations. And that's very much the territory that she's going to take us through this evening. So with no more ceremony, over to you, Georgina.
Thank you very much, Helen. Hello, I'm Georgina, and thank you very much for coming today. As Helen mentioned, I'm a research fellow at the University of Cambridge, but I used to study English at York and I have fond memories of the city. So before we get on to discussing York's wonderful new printing press with Helen and JT, I'm going to be talking about the horizons of print in literature and how that phrase, the horizons of print, might prompt us to think about books and reading differently. And I'm going to do that by making some connections between the places that books can take us to in our imagination and the places that books as printed physical objects travel to and from. And in my own research, I focus on literature from around 1600. So I'll be talking about some Shakespeare, as well as one quirky and lesser known 17th century book. But we'll also think about contemporary novels and what it means to read on a Kindle. So this talk's in two parts. Part one is called Fictional Horizons and is about the imagined places to which literature might take us. Part two is about the journeys of reading material itself and how those journeys were changed by the invention of print. And I'll finish by tying those thoughts together with an interactive book of poetry and pictures, now printed almost 400 years ago, but which prompts us to think about the real and imagined horizons of print today. So part one. Fictional horizons. Why should we read? Ask Google this question and you'll get repeated versions of a similar answer. Reading improves the imagination, expands the mind, and transports us into another world. One website, literacyworks.org, cites a paper from Emory University to claim that neuroscientists found that reading a good novel allows one's imagination to take flight. Reading a good science fiction novel, for example, can transport you to a fantasy world that becomes reality in your mind's eye. Actually, the neuroscientists said nothing of the sort. The scientists in question had experimented with getting a group of participants to read a novel, Robert Harris's Pompeii, if you know it, across 9 evenings. And the experiment confirmed that reading sections of a novel the previous evening led to significant common alteration of the reader's resting state networks. Reading changes your brain. But the way that most people like to talk about this phenomenon is closer to the rhetoric of literacyworks.org than to the findings of this scientific paper. We like to think about reading, particularly reading fiction, as an activity which transports us across the world. Reading Wuthering Heights is to be tossed on the tumultuous Yorkshire moors. Reading Wolf Hall is to travel to the political battlefields of the Tudor court. Reading Winnie the Pooh is to be whisked off to the 100-acre wood. So one of the great things about reading is the way it takes us out of ourselves, puts us metaphorically into other minds and other places, allows us to travel beyond the tube carriage or the beach towel from which we're currently following the exploits of Heathcliff, Thomas Cromwell, or Tigger. This idea that reading transports the reader isn't new. In 1797, the novelist William Godwin wrote an essay entitled Of an Early Taste for Reading, in which he suggested that he that loves reading has everything within his reach, and that in a well-written book, we are presented with the happiest flights of a mind of uncommon excellence. Godwin is making a lot of assumptions here, both about the type of reader, referred to as he, and what counts as good or successful reading. For Godwin, reading both brings everything within reach and allows the reader to take flight, or at least it does if the book is well written according to Godwin's criteria. In all these enthusiastic aspirations about what reading might or could be, the aim is always to escape the reader's own situation. We're here this evening at a festival whose very title, New Horizons, suggests a similar idea, that going to talks and events might expand our own intellectual horizons and take us out of ourselves, allow us to have new thoughts, which is, metaphorically, to put us somewhere new. After months of lockdown, the ability to travel across the newly enforced horizons of our own front doors is both newly appealing and newly urgent. So tonight I'm going to consider the horizons of printed texts and of reading. How far can reading take us? How far do books let us travel? But I also want to broaden the horizon of that question and think about books as objects in and of themselves. William Godwin's words only survive today because they were printed on paper in 1797 in London on Paternoster Row and in Dublin on College Green. New editions have of course been made since then, but those 18th century sheets of paper travelled from London and Dublin and now lie in libraries and on bookshelves around the world. So in this talk, I'll be suggesting that the horizons of print are not only the places which stories carve out in our imagination, but also a way of thinking about where books as physical objects come from and where they go. So in Chimamanda Adichie's 2006 novel, Half of a Yellow Sun, the houseboy Ugru overhears heated conversations between the character he calls Master and his guests. Later, as he sat on the backyard steps reading the Pickwick Papers, stopping often to think and to watch the slender leaves of corn swish in the breeze, he was not surprised to hear Master's voice raised from the living room. The Pickwick Papers erupt onto the stage of Half a Yellow Sun, signalling Adichie's place in a longer literary history shaped by global politics and colonialism. If there seems to be something entirely incongruous about transplanting Dickens' breezy travelogue into the political conflict of late 1960s Nigeria, then Ugru's copy of the Pickwick Papers traces the damaging channels of people and power structures which entered the country from the UK. The presence of the Pickwick Papers in Adichie's novel has another, specifically literary, effect. Pickwick was created to career around 19th century England, but Half a Yellow Sun catapults the character into its own narrative frame, changing both how we might read Pickwick and his latest fictional reader. Adichie presents us with an image of Ugru, which seems to delve inside his mind, he was not surprised to hear, but also refuses us full access. When Ugru stops reading to think, we know that he can see slender leaves of corn, and we know that he can hear raised voices, but we don't know what it is that he's thinking. Is he considering the domestic dynamics playing out between the master and his guests? Is he musing on the impending war? Or have the Pickwick Papers taken him somewhere that we, as readers of Half a Yellow Sun, can't follow? Somewhere furnished with Dickensian descriptions of crimson-covered benches and a four-wheeled chaise. An otherwise glowing review of Half of a Yellow Sun in the Los Angeles Times picked out this moment of Ugru's reading for criticism. In her eagerness to focus on the most dramatic and traumatic aspects of her story, Adichie occasionally passes up some potentially rich opportunities to delve into other aspects of her characters' minds. What, for instance, could Aubrey be thinking as he's reading the Pickwick Papers while the world around him is falling apart? But the refusal to give us access to Aubrey's mind here is precisely the point. If we, as readers of Half a Yellow Sun, have been transported into the world of Adichie's novel, Aubrey is one step ahead of us, reading himself into another imaginary world. So Adichie is writing in the early 21st century about a character in the 1960s. But authors writing hundreds of years before her similarly knew that fiction had the ability to transport its readers elsewhere. In Shakespeare's tragedy, King Lear, the blinded Gloucester is led to what he believes is a cliff edge. Edgar describes to Gloucester the fiction of its dizzying heights. Here's the place, he says. How fearful and dizzy it is to cast one's eyes so low. The crows and choughs that wing the midway air show scarce so gross as beetles. Halfway down hangs one that gathers samphire, dreadful trade. Methinks he seems no bigger than his head. Edgar describes the physical objects surrounding the cliff edge, the crows, the samphire gatherer. He successfully tricks Gloucester because he describes these things from the perspective of someone actually standing at the top of a cliff, the vertigo caused by casting one's eyes so low, the fact that a man looks no bigger than his head. So Edgar's performing the transportative qualities of descriptive language, the way that words create images which airlift us into another perspective. The tragedy here is in deceiving a blinded man. Edgar may tell us that I do trifle thus with his despair to cure it, that is, to stop Gloucester leaping off an actual cliff, but there's an uncomfortable edge to the whole scene. In performance, Gloucester appears more vividly deluded because we can physically see what he cannot. Edgar and he are no nearer a cliff edge than they are as Specsavers. As theatre audiences, we're trained to allow for some suspension of disbelief. Sound effects, props, costumes, and actors are there to represent worlds beyond the limits of the stage, but we also know when to stop believing. Gloucester's utter despair is different to Edgar's samphire gathering because within the fictional world of the play, we know to believe in one and not the other. In a theatre, we have to suspend our disbelief to filter out the squeaking seats, the coughing, the rustle of a neighbour's wine gums. This moment in King Lear awkwardly brings into view the limits of that belief because we're forced to confront that Edgar is making up the existence of the cliff edge. The audience is complicit in the fact that Gloucester is very much not where the images in his mind eye would take him. So all of this is to imagine ourselves in a theatre, but reading King Lear is a very different experience to watching it. If we read Edgar's speech, whether in a hefty complete works or a cheap Oxfam paperback, we are more likely to topple into the mental space of the cliff edge where Gloucester believes himself to be. On stage, it's clear Gloucester is in no imminent danger of falling, but reading King Lear, we experience the fictional descriptions of the coastline as just another set of images with which the play presents us. Similarly, the text will imaginatively transport us to Goneril and Regan's lavish homes and later a storm-lashed moor, and we have to work hard as readers to sift the fictional from the real places within the play. And that intellectual sieving can be harder when, without props and costumes and scene changes, the only material connection a reader has with the landscape of King Lear is the physical text in their hand. So while printed books provide access into a world of fiction, these hefty props can also be a barrier, a reminder of the distance between us and the lives of characters. I'm sure you're all familiar with that feeling of having aching arms from propping up one side of an overly wordy tome, or grappling with a dust jacket, which seems infuriatingly designed to slip from the grasp. Stories don't exist in the ether, but come to us via physical objects like books, or nowadays, screens. The book, or the Kindle, or the iPad, or the sheet of printed paper announces King Lear as a play, as something written, created, conjured up, something separate to us, into which we momentarily enter at our leisure and at our peril. So that's the end of part one about the fictional horizons of literature, and I'm going to move now to part two. So in the second part of this talk, I want to shift from thinking about the imagined places to which literature transports us to consider the stuff that literature is made of. That is, to think about the limits and the horizons of physical reading material. In 2021, hanging on to this idea that texts are physical objects is both harder and more important than it has ever been. Many of the devices on which we now read, as well as browse, message, shop, and everything else, are designed to disappear from conscious view. Tech giant Apple promotes its products as extensions of their human users rather than clunkily present gadgets. The iPad, for example, strains to vanish into the cognitive world of its user, to be so instinctive as to synchronize with one's thoughts as they arise. In fact, our media world is more rather than less material than it ever was. The internet relies on miles of underground cables, while phones and laptops require tons of glass, plastic, and mined metal. But the aim of all of this stuff is to aid technology in its quest for invisibility and inscrutability, to make us, in some sense, forget the alien nature of the object in our midst. If books are portals into other imaginative worlds, then books, like all of the material baggage weighing down the reader, is most successful when it disappears. But all the glass and the plastic and the paper and the ink came from somewhere, and when we finished reading, it will end up somewhere too. In recent years, there's been a push to make consumers realize the ecological consequences of their increasingly digital purchases. But the old-fashioned printed book is also made up of materials that were made and traveled around the world. If one of the most appealing characteristics of printed stories or plays is that they allow us imaginatively to travel beyond the limits of the book itself, then they also contain within them the histories and the geographies of their own making. And this was as much true for the earliest forms of books as it is now in our age of globalization. For example, 18th century books used ink made from oak galls from Syria, gum arabic from Sudan, and chemical compounds made in England. Or, to take another example, at the time when Shakespeare was writing King Lear, nearly all English texts were printed on paper made in France. It's exciting, perhaps troubling, perhaps thought-provoking to consider that these books contain material which has travelled through many hands and across many places. But does it matter when we read books where the stuff within them came from? Well, one 17th century writer thought it definitely did and wrote a whole poem on the matter called The Praise of Hempseed. The poet was called John Taylor, and he was fascinated by the global travels of paper. Nowadays, we make paper from trees, but the earlier stuff was made from old linen rags. The early modern canon is essentially printed on recycled sheets, cloths, and underwear. In this world, smirked Taylor, might the cast that chaste Lucretia wore bear bawdy lines between a knave and a whore. That is to say, the dress worn by a mythologized ideal of virtuous womanhood might have been used to write the early modern equivalent of 50 Shades of Grey. Not only did the paper on which Taylor's poem is printed travel to London from France, but these sheets had a prior life circulating in people's wardrobes and linen closets. Literature, from this perspective, is a perilous and contingent category, mixed up in the daily stuff of the world as it travelled through different forms before ending up as a book. So if we delve back into this literary history, we can become more aware of how writers have always thought about the ever-expanding horizons of print. That is to say, we can start to see both how literature transports us imaginatively to new places, but also how the physical stuff from which literature is made lets us in on the stories of its own. Paper and ink have their own set of adventures, but print and the invention of the printing press is a seismic moment in the history of how literature crosses new horizons. It takes a gear shift to think about that today, when we're so used to the fact that emails or WhatsApps transport text around the world in the blink of an eye. Free from the cumbersome materiality of print and of paper, messages in 2021 whiz from writer to reader faster than ever. But for those experiencing the early world of print, media was the speediest it had ever been. And that was because of the technology of the printing press, which was an upgrade from the old way of doing things when scribes had to copy out texts by hand. So the magic of the printing press was that pamphlets and stories and legal orders could be pumped out at top speed and disseminated around the country or even the world. If lots of people wanted to read King Lear in the 17th century, they didn't have to breathe down the neck of their more fortunate friend until they had finished with their painfully transcribed version. With the printing press, our keen reader of Shakespeare, or sermons, or smutty poems, or political pamphlets was much more likely to be able to get their hands on their own copy. I've already suggested that Edgar's description of the cliff edge transports its readers to new imaginative places. But now we might think about how Edgar's words, printed as well as handwritten and performed, could travel around and reach more readers, transporting them in turn to the moors and the coasts of Shakespeare's tragic play. So for the final part, I want to finish by bringing all of this together, not with Shakespeare and not with drama, but from a strange and little-known book printed in 1635 called A Collection of Emblems. And this book is helpful for us because it foregrounds at the same time the imagined and the real journeys of printed books, and it will lead us on nicely to Helen and JT's discussion of the printing press. So A Collection of Emblems may not have the most riveting title, but as a reading experience, it varies wildly somewhere between the annoyingly preachy and the thrillingly revealing. Emblems work a bit like a fortune cookie in offering pieces of moral or spiritual advice. And they look like this. So they combine an image with a snappy couplet at the top and a longer 30-line poem. There were 200 in total in this book, but thankfully the reader was pointed straight towards the emblem most apt for them. And that was because rather than being read from start to finish, A Collection of Emblems sends its reader on non-linear journeys around its pages. And it does this by means of a rotatable paper dial, or the technical word for this is a volval, reminiscent of those spinning pointers used in a game of Twister. Turn one of the paper dials in The Collection of Emblems, and it will tell you not to put your left foot on yellow, but to go to, for example, emblem 37 in the first quarter of the book. So these paper dials turn the collection of emblems into a particular kind of place. This book is no longer a block of printed text through which we have to scan dutifully from start to finish, but instead something to be dipped into and out of. This distracted, non-linear mode of reading is probably one with which many of us are familiar, and which we often assume is only a recent phenomenon, a symptom of those unfortunate deep dives into the Guardian comments section online. But in fact, 17th century readers shared our sense of reading material as a terrain which could be rerouted and explored at will. So on the screen now, you can see pictures of different copies of this book which survive in research libraries. So the one on the left is in the Huntington Library in California, and you can see it's beautifully intact, whereas the one on the right in Oxford has lost its paper hands altogether. So the contrast between these surviving copies of A Collection of Emblems remind us that books don't remain whole over time. Bits of them fall off, end up in the bin, or are carted off in the pocket of an overzealous reader. So when we think about the journeys on which books embark, A Collection of Emblems, with its sometimes missing paper hands, prompts us to think about the ways in which part of a book might travel around on its own to be lost or turn up elsewhere. So those journeys of books might be global, like those travels of paper and ink we saw earlier, or more local, like the slippery dust jacket you removed from the latest Lee Child and which unfortunately got lost on the train. So A Collection of Emblems was put together by a guy called George Wither, who was only too aware that books travelled round in parts. Wither started trying to put this book together many years before 1635, but he was delayed because he couldn't get hold of the pictures. Books have their own multitude of histories and geographies, and this is particularly visible in A Collection of Emblems because its pictures, like its paper, were imported from overseas. George Wither grumpily reported that the engraved images could not be procured out of Holland upon any reasonable condition, although the finished book suggests he did eventually get hold of them. So each page in this book is a collection of parts, paper, ink, quotations, but also engravings, which had their own prior lives and journeys. So they come together only fleetingly on the page to form a seemingly coherent emblem. So what happens when we plunge into the middle of this book by spinning the dial? What inner secrets might the jostling collection of text and images reveal? Well, time and time again, this book imagines its readers as intrepid voyagers. One emblem reads, "He that his course directly steers, nor storms nor windy censures fears." A collection of emblems is very keen for everyone to be a good and virtuous Christian, and it offers these nuggets of spiritual advice by getting the reader to imagine themselves on a journey. The text imaginatively lifts the reader out of the space of the book and places them in their mind's eye on the open seas. So there's three kinds of journey present in these pages on a spectrum of kind of fictional to real. So firstly, the language of a collection of emblems takes the reader to new horizons in their imagination. Secondly, the printed words and images were themselves duplicated and travelled around libraries such that they now end up all over the world. And at the same time, these spinning dials make the reader into a navigator of a book who travels across the paper horizons of the page. So at the start of this talk, I asked why we should read. It seems to be a given that the great power of books is in their ability to transport us to different places, to take us to new imaginative horizons. But having looked at these books through the ages, including a collection of emblems, but also King Lear and Half a Yellow Sun, we might now think about the horizons of books in a different way. That is, we might now take into account the ways that readers travel around inside books, and the ways that printed books themselves are made up of parts which came from all over the world. This kind of thinking means remembering that texts are not only neat little ideas which shuttle obediently from writer to reader, but the vehicles of those ideas themselves. That is, books are objects whose materials have their own journeys and their own stories to tell, which are increasingly legible if only we look for them. So to think about the stuff that literature is made of in the most literal sense is interesting to us as general readers. We're increasingly aware of the resources and the labour which go into many of our products, not only books, but also the technologies which allow us to read on Kindles, phones, and digital billboards. And these ideas are coming to the fore in English departments across universities. Thinking about books as material objects helps us to trace the history of the book, the shift from medieval scroll to interactive 17th century emblem book to hefty Dickensian tome to 21st century e-books. Today, we've been thinking about books both as collections of words, ideas, and stories, but also printed objects which have been on their own journeys. Studying the materiality of books can take our thinking about books and about reading in new directions. And with that in mind, the English department at York University, headed up by Helen, rustled up the funds to buy their very own set of historic printing presses for teaching and for research. So now we're going to hear from Helen and JT about the adventures of their thin ice press, how it changed their thinking and propelled their English department across new horizons. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Georgina, for a really fascinating talk. It was fantastic to hear and fantastic to think about what it is that you've been doing with these books and the kind of work you've done with original text to help you think in real detail about the journeys of books past and present. It's wonderful to see as well that we've got 2 questions lined up in the chat there already. So please do keep them coming. Please do add more questions for Georgina as JT and I give you our little tour here. 3 questions, great. And also feel free to pose questions to JT and I about the printing studio. So I will introduce it now. We're here in the background, my colleague, JT Welsch, who is a senior lecturer in English here at the University of York. He's also, of course, as I said at the beginning, co-founder of Thin Ice Press. His research and creative practice focuses on language and the ethics of creative labour. And he's author of The Selling and Self-Regulation of Contemporary Poetry, which was published last year. He's co-editor of Wretched Strangers, Borders, Movement, Homes with Agnes Lehowski from Boiler House Press in 2018, a really important and influential collection. And JT has published a number of poetry books, including letterpress editions of his own work, produced right here in Thin Ice Press. So, JT. But what we want to tell you about very briefly is what has happened in this room here. So just over 3 years ago, this was a silent study room here at the University of York with lots of desks clustered together and not altogether well used much of the time. So we were looking for a space where we could fulfill a long-held, if slightly different or slightly distant set of dreams. I very much wanted to have a printing press on which we could do bibliographic work and teach students about the nuts and bolts of early printing. And JT was thinking about producing editions, producing books, getting students' creative work out there in really interesting and exciting ways. What we came up with was this space, which is Thin Ice Press. And from an empty room, we have transformed it over the past years in ways that JT will now illustrate. So let me switch my camera and JT will give you a little tour.
Hello, yes, welcome virtually to Thin Ice Press. As Helen said, we've spent the past few years filling this room with all the stuff that Georgina was talking about. So, thinking about the paper and the type and all the different implements that are required for printing. I guess knowing for ourselves that, in Europe at least, this is how books were made for the past 400 years, really slowly, really painfully, and kind of, meticulously kind of pieced together with individual pieces of type locked together in metal frames and put on presses like the one behind me. So the room, you can see around me, we've kind of set it up to simulate a historic printing house. So over here, we have the area where people would be doing the typesetting. All of these jobs would have been done historically by different people, a kind of assembly line. Someone would stand here with a setting stick in one hand, taking letters of type out of cases like this, one at a time, putting together a line and then doing another line, bringing them over here then to the imposing stone, where you'd assemble it all, as I said, a metal frame, which could then be taken over to the press. This is a very small print for a very large press. This is one of our oldest presses. This is a Colombian press. It was made in London in 1838. It was quite a popular press at the time. Most presses did not need to be this ornate. It's a bit decorative, kind of unnecessarily, maybe in the fashion of the early 19th century. A lot of them have different paint jobs. Ours has bits of gold on the eagle up here. The eagle is the counterweight for the press. What happens when you print is you put the type down here on the bed, you put the paper over it, you ink it, you put the paper over it, and you pull the handle, just as I did. So I'll show you around a little bit, and then I am going to pull a print as well. These are our other presses over here. A few different styles. These are mostly from the 19th century original iron presses that are still going strong. They really made them nicely. This is a treadle press. It's kind of like an old sewing machine. You work it with a pedal, a bit more automated then. You can be much more quick than you can with the flat iron presses. We've got a few other styles of those flat iron presses. These are Albion presses, a smaller one here and a larger one there, and another treadle press in the middle. And back on the other side of the room, I will just quickly finish by showing you our work in progress, which is a replica wooden common press. So this is very much like the press that Johannes Gutenberg started using around 1450. This is a replica of a specific press that was owned, we think, by Thomas Gent, who was a printer in York in the early 18th century, 1730s. Like a lot of other printers, York was a real center for printing. There's an area in town that you might have seen the little red devil on Stonegate. That's a symbol of the printer's devil. And down that alley there, was the printer's quarter. So Thomas Gent printed in York, and we have his old press. It's completely in ruins and so we're building a new one. So come back and visit us in a few years' time, hopefully soon enough, and we'll have this all finished. We're waiting for the blacksmith to do the metal part. So we are doing it properly and authentically. I'll just finish then quickly by showing you how the printing works. So in theory, you can do whole books. You can print, 8 pages at a time up, but it all works with the same principle. We need paper, we need ink, and we need some type, and we need to press them all together. So I'm going to charge my roller here on the ink plate, some very dazzling blue ink, and I will put this so that I'm rolling it. So I've got some type already on the bed of the press, rolling the ink across here. Should be good. Okay. And got a sheet of paper. So we've got a few different parts in the press. This is the bed of the press where the type sits. This is the tympan and the frisket. Tympan like a drum. And the paper goes in here, and all the presses, the wooden press, it's exactly the same function as the iron presses. It was just in the early 19th century, they switched to the metal. They could withstand the higher pressure. And then we fold it down. I've done this on the wrong side, haven't I? Fold it down. Sorry. Very choreographed here. We crank the bread into the press. And this thing here is the platen. This is what's going to press down. It's a simple motion. It's just a single handle that comes across. If I crank this back out, fingers crossed, we should have a print. Yes. So we've got a quote from John Milton here about how great books are. But yeah, that's really all there is to it. It's not a complicated, it's not a heavy machine to lift, but they did work very long hours in very, dark, dim conditions, and they trained for years to learn to do all these different parts of this. So yes, that's how printing works, and that's what we do here at Thin Ice.
So that's us. That's Thin Ice Press for you. And as JT says, what we are interested in is a combination of historical printing techniques, of thinking about what it means to put type onto a page and to put type together in different ways, thinking about what that felt like for early workers and for people much more recently, but also engaging with some of the fantastic letterpress community out there who are doing amazing work in letterpress today and who've been really lucky to learn from and work with in different ways over the past few years. And we've learned a tremendous amount from being part of that community, as well as all sorts of things about things we need, always slightly more than we've got, and what goes on in a printing house, both historical and modern. We do use this space with students, and we're really looking forward to the moment when we can have students back on campus and back in here working with us, with our brilliant Print Society, who have been doing painstaking work to learn printing from first principles, and work together with us and our printing in residence to bring some of their printing knowledge into being. We also work on book projects and other prints, and we've got some exciting collaborations and some exciting things going on, which we can talk about if people want to ask about those in questions, but also that we'll be really delighted to share with you all over the coming months and years. So I see we have lots of questions queued up. So I think the best bet is if I invite Georgina to come back up and to join us here on screen, and then we'll run through these questions. I'll share the questions and chime in whenever seems appropriate, and we'll take it from there. So our first question, Georgina, is for you. It's a really interesting point, the question says, about how we understand stories and fictional horizons across live theatre versus reading experiences. And the question is, how would you say that audiobooks or the recent surge into listening to books fits into this? Is there a different experience when we're being guided into, perhaps across a horizon, by a different voice rather than our own?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Thank you. I was thinking a little bit about it because actually, I think audiobooks are a kind of recent phenomenon, and they can trigger in us a kind of, I don't know, sometimes an almost snobbishness about, what counts as reading. But it's interesting because in the past, obviously, literacy rates were very different to today. And this meant that lots of people accessed texts by the spoken word. So, for example, if you went to church, you'd have a sermon kind of, preached to you, and that's how you'd absorb religious texts. So I think actually, the kind of idea of reading as a silent, isolated activity is a relatively modern one, and I think our kind of interest in audiobooks, I guess the difference is that there is still an isolation. If you imagine the trope of the 21st century, people lined up on a tube with their earphones plugged in, kind of in their own imaginative world, that is different to a kind of group experience. But I think it still definitely counts as reading, and I think it must affect, you have, I guess, less control over the intonation. You kind of, and you can't necessarily, well, it's harder at least, isn't it, to kind of navigate backwards and forwards. You're kind of on a certain pathway, as it were, that someone's taken you through, although you can, insist on skipping around and stopping and starting. But yeah, I think it definitely counts as reading, and it brings its own kind of challenges and opportunities to the way that we experience text.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to invite JT to chip in this next question as well, because it's very much his territory too. So perhaps we can start with you, Georgina, and then see if JT wants to add anything. The question from Etta: you've mentioned how we've moved from audible to interactive physical print to digital readers. Where do you think the physical horizons of books might head next? Obviously, letterpress is the only answer.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But, Georgina, you go first.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's a kind of there's always a nostalgia, isn't it? It's like when ebooks sort of erupted onto the scene, and we had this whole fear that we'd lose hard copy books, but actually that's not the case. I mean, just as when the printing press was invented, manuscript, like that is sort of handwritten text, continued to be written and disseminated and read. So I think maybe we'll just have a kind of increased variety of kinds of text that exist side by side. But JT, what would be your answer?
Yeah, I mean, I think similar. I think you're right that the power of nostalgia, or just the kind of idea that things come in cycles and that we can never get away, where we have physical bodies and we experience the world materially. So I love what you were saying about the kind of ways that even when we think we're doing something in a digital, really abstract realm, that it's still material. And I think you can see, like in book culture on Instagram, or Bookstagram, as they call it, that often, you'll see images of like, books positioned with flowers on a table where you can see the grain of the wood. And actually people really, even in a digital realm, are trying to simulate that kind of tactility and that materiality and that sense that things are, physical. You see poets on Instagram writing things with old typewriters and stuff. And then you could dismiss that, I guess, as just a kind of nostalgia and kind of a slightly kitschy retro feel. But actually, I think there's something really interesting going on there about how the digital and material work together. So I don't think either are going away. I think we're just going to see more interesting, cross-pollination between them. Yeah.
Definitely. And what you're saying makes me remember there's a kind of trend, isn't there, of kind of fake books almost, book wallpaper or things in the shape of books. And then you have a weird separation between a physical copy of a book and actually anything textual. And it's just the material form that we cling on to in a kind of age where we feel it's rushing away from us.
Thank you both very much. And now another question about, which follows on really nicely, I think, from what JT was just saying about Bookstagram, heading into a more and more tech-focused world. Do you think a new horizon in literature is emerging in the way books now draw together online communities and discussion through mediums such as TikTok, BookTok, or YouTube, BookTube, or of course we can add then Bookstagram as the example that JT gave us. Would you feel that was one you were willing to have a go at, Georgina?
Maybe JT, you should start. I feel like that's your
I do. I mean, well, this event is an example of that, right? We have a kind of a sense of community that can be virtual, but be, really meaningful and really like, is not just a kind of second best thing to being able to being in a room together. It can create different kinds of community. And I think, we're seeing more and more of that. I think, technology, like in other fields where people talk about, I guess, like the film industry, and now anybody can make a film just on their phone. Similar things where people are setting up publishing houses, in their spare room and using digital printing technologies and cheap kind of print on demand book technologies that are absolutely changing that landscape and making kinds of books possible that, in different, local communities and different global communities, possible that, through those technologies. Yeah.
Thank you, JT. And another question, which is a really interesting take on this and takes us back to the beginning of your talk, I think, Georgina, about the world we live in now and how it has changed. Could that influence the fictional horizons writers want to explore? I suppose the thought that puts into my head is the kind of the problem of the COVID-19 pandemic, the sense of kind of writers trying to work out what kind of near future they want to set fictions in, and how you respond to something that's changed so radically about the way we connect. And I believe that's been something that people have really been wrestling with and thinking about. But do you have any thoughts on that sense of how our own kind of changing relationships to technology and the shifts of recent years might be changing those fictional horizons?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's interesting again to kind of look back before we look forwards, in that, again, when the printing press is first invented, then travel is just much less frequent than it is now. So in a kind of, 2 years ago present, then actually there was a different question of we were physically traveling around a lot, and therefore kind of writers trying to set things in dystopian future, you had kind of a bigger geographical range to kind of pick and choose from. But now, as I kind of briefly mentioned, as Helen was picking up on there's this kind of weird entrapment. So the fictional horizons of literature, but of other kinds of art as well, are so kind of important to us. And I guess it's whether we want to be reminded of what's just outside our door, or whether we want to kind of zoom into the future, and whether there's a kind of there's a kind of political versus escapism clash there. As in, do we want to be reminded of all the possible problems that are to come, or do we actually need to escape from those and therefore want to be transported into somewhere that bears no relation to our current, climate or its potential kind of catastrophic futures?
Thank you very much. And then I think we've got a question here for the three of us. The discussion of physical literature and physical printing is really interesting. Do you think we could ever see a return to independent physical presses in the same way digital e-readers surged and then started to fall as we returned to physical books? I think in one sense our answer to that has to be yes, and that the kind of tradition of fine press printing is really vibrant, and there's really interesting book production and letterpress printing going on in terms of small presses, and people being really keen to think about the variety of small presses and what they can do, and where that goes. But if you don't mind me also turning over to JT again, I think some of the ideas as well, that one of the things we might do is merge some of these possibilities and bring them together in really interesting ways.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think I a lot of my research is around poetry, and I think that's an area where there's something about the use of the page is already material and visual, and so I think we're seeing an explosion really in tiny micro presses, as a lot of them call themselves, with one or two people running these things, and partly that's led by the technology, but partly I think there's just a kind of a general desire for the kind of seeing that production process and how that all connects, and kind of breaking down some of that kind of invisibility of when you go to a shop and you buy a book and you don't really know where it's come from, where it's made. When you can see something that is slightly handmade, I think that kind of aesthetic. I mean, we've all seen the more superficial side of that, and kind of, I don't know, McDonald's calling certain sandwiches artisanal or handcrafted, and all these kinds of this rhetoric. But the serious side of that, I think, is kind of like what Georgina was saying, like caring about where things come from in the world, caring about the materials that they come from and how they're reused and different things, and all that. I think that demands a kind of questioning of, like, thinking about the book substance itself as well. So it's an exciting time for these kinds of experiments, I think.
Definitely. And it seems that as our kind of technology increases, actually that gives us more scope and more kind of capacity to investigate these things further and to create new material forms. So actually, yeah, the kind of digital and material go together more than one could sort of replace the other, I think.
So here's a question that I think brings us firmly back to your paper, Georgina. Which is, do you believe, given its unique approach, that the choose your own adventure style of plot navigation has been unfairly relegated to the kids, teens, young adult genre? I'm thinking relegated to my childhood experiences as a reader. Does it have greater potential? And I suppose this is kind of tying in, are there other examples, the question asks, of things like this beyond the emblems that you mentioned, so more kind of historical adventures of choose your own adventure in different ways?
That's such a great question, because when I've talked about this research in other forms, people have always, it's kind of sparked memories of their own childhood books and their own versions of Choose Your Own Adventures, which I think are so popular now. And I think so historically there's many examples. I mean, often I think the emblems is particularly interesting for me because it's a kind of poetic, imaginative text with this interactivity. The way you see it most often is actually in quite scientific books, definitely aimed at adults. This is still in the kind of early 16th century, where you're actually using these paper dials to kind of navigate and you measure high tide and work out when the sun's going to rise. So there's a kind of definitely pedagogical strain, which is quite different to how we see it now. Later on, it is often used for children. You get kind of, little paper cutout dolls, that kind of paper interactivity. So I think it does both. I think it's the kind of the sort of BBC dream of, entertain and educate and inform all at once. And I think and I guess it's interesting, even with kind of Kindles now, we have our own version of interactivity and we have a kind of tactile relationship with the things that we read. And it's just the extent to which these forms kind of make us conscious of that or not.
Yes, so the example I love is also from this period of the Virgilian sortes or bibliomancy. So the idea, it's not just choose your own adventure in terms of telling where the book will take you, it's use a book to tell you how to choose the next adventure in your existence. So open a book at random, usually the Bible, and put your finger inside it, and that will tell you how to live your life. So it's a kind of a gripping and full immersive choose your own adventure experience.
Don't try this at home, maybe.
But choose the right book before you try it at home. So one for me and JT, the printing studio sounds great, thank you. Do you think the study of literature will start including more a physical study of books, as Georgina mentioned, in degrees going forward?
I hope so. It certainly is here. And it certainly, has been really exciting to see what the students kind of do with these things. Students of a generation you might think of as digital natives, just the kind of the excitement of handling, the type and seeing books made in this way. I mean, book history has been, is a fairly established kind of sub-discipline within literature, and understanding those things has been happening for, a good few decades now, but often it is a bit more, it's archival or it's kind of abstract. And so what we're trying to do here, as far as we know, we're the only English department in the country, maybe one of the few in the world that has its own printing studio, print room within it. in this way. A lot of times, if a university has printing presses, it will be maybe in a design department or an art department, and they'll be, printmaking in different ways. So it's a good question. I think it's something we're trying to drive, and we're connecting with lots of people through this work, I guess, who have that sense that actually, you can do this research, but to come in here and to actually do some typesetting and to see what it's like and see what that labor feels like, see what it feels like physically to stand at a press and pull that bar and to roll that ink. It really changes your perception of that work. So it's exciting for research. And like I said, seeing the students in here, it's just been a big bonus. Yeah.
Okay, so then we've got a question here, jumping off what JT said about physical substance. And I think this is a question that speaks to all of our interests in different ways. I've noticed through Bookstagram that there's a starting trend in mystery stories or crime novels where to create an unreliable narrator, but to do that, I suppose, through playing with the shape of the text. So this is the idea that characters have written in the margins or have scratched out text or changed or intervened in the physical story in some way. And the question is, do you think this is new? Or is it an evolution of the interactive dial you mentioned, Georgina? Or I guess, is there somewhere else you think that this tradition comes from?
Do you want me to start? Sorry.
If you're up for it, yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think the kind of traces of the kind of imaginative potential of the traces of readers is a really fascinating topic. I mean, just as on a kind of more basic level in the archive, it's really amazing when you see kind of handwritten annotations which does happen. You get printed books, and then someone was reading Shakespeare in 1623, and they come along and write a little note, being like, "Oh, I like this bit," or "This bit's quite boring," or better cross out the naughty bits. And that's always quite fun. But I guess what you're saying is a bit different because it's a version of actually kind of bringing the reader, making us more conscious of the material form as we read. And I think there are just going to be more and more examples of that, because I think it is, as we kind of have said already slightly, is that kind of collision of our interest in the digital and the kind of the technological potential that presents us to the book form, but also the material. And again, that kind of a weird crossover of the nostalgia of the book form and also a pushing at the limits of what the book can do. It seems like there's examples that you're describing. I haven't seen, I need to go and have a look, obviously, but that sounds like a really great example of that.
Yeah, I mean, there have been lots of great examples. I don't know if you're thinking of things like House of Leaves or Ship of Theseus, or really fun, experiments that in some ways are kind of one-off, and you keep thinking with each of them, oh, this is going to be the next big craze, and there are going to be loads of these. I think there are lots of subtle things that are happening with books as well. When you go into a bookshop and you look at kind of the big bestsellers on the table, the effect that digital culture has had on book cover design and kinds of things, lots of embossing, lots of things where you're starting to see gilt gold around the edges of the pages again, and kinds of things that have a real feel, or different kinds of paper and cloth binding and things that, I guess partly because the technology has made these kinds of things cheaper and more accessible, but I think people want something that will, take an interesting picture on a phone that they can then tweet or post on Instagram, but also something that when they hold the book, they think, oh, this is really nice. And it sends that kind of tingle into you that, even before you've read a page of it, you feel like there's something interesting going on here, separate to the content. Yeah.
Thank you both. And I think it's interesting as well, because there are older examples of books that talk about this kind of play. So Walter Scott or whoever would kind of have fantasies of receiving letters, or kind of they kind of imagine a material frame into the text. And then what you're talking about is where people actually kind of make that present on the page, these inventive typographic techniques. And I'm trying to think if there are any early modern examples. We've got people like Thomas Nash, who leaves a box for the reader to write in some of their own content, which is kind of a version of some of this, or an anticipation of some of it, perhaps, though not quite the same thing. Go on, Georgina.
I just thought of another great one, which is Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy, which invites you to draw in the widow, and there's a kind of box for you to do that. And obviously people do or people don't, I don't know. But there's a kind of fun, I guess, if you were to trace all the copies of our books and see the kind of blank versus the different versions, and then that character is therefore not stable because the way they're visually represented or not, whether by a blank page or someone's terrible, in my case, artistic scribble, would then vary for every copy.
Brilliant. Well, I'm afraid we have to draw the event to a close. We're really grateful for all your questions and for the kind of positive and enthusiastic comments in the Q&A as well. That's really nice to see. So we have got one last question, which we should definitely answer from Lisa, which is, under non-pandemic circumstances, do you allow members of the public to visit Thin Ice Press?
Yes, please come and see us. You can't quite see here. We've got windows. We're in a bit of a fishbowl. We often have people kind of staring at the window, trying to figure out what it is exactly we're doing in here. Please do come see us at the university and knock on the door, or well, we do have public workshops normally as part of festival ideas and other kinds of things. So keep an eye. We do have a webpage as well, thinicepress.org, I think. Yes. Yeah. Look us up and come see us, please. Yes.
Absolutely, yeah. We are delighted to welcome members of the public, and it's been really fantastic. One of the lovely things I think for both of us about this space has been the way it's brought in people who are interested in print, and the way it's opened up links for us across the university with people who are keen to see what's going on in here and what we're up to, and that we've had wonderful collaborations and working relationships with people who've come in to see what we're up to and what we're doing. So yes, we absolutely are open to the public. As JT says, once we're able to do so again, we're really looking forward to having public workshops, possibly even some evening classes if we can make that happen. So definitely space here. So do look us up. So it only remains for me to say a very warm thank you to JT Welsch and to Georgina Wilson all the way away in Cambridge, and say a really warm thanks as well to you for being here with us this evening. We're sorry we can't have you here in person. We're glad of the digital technologies that let us come together for this kind of event nonetheless, and we really look forward to the moment when you can have material contact with the kind of physical books and material things that we do here at Thin Ice Press. Thank you very much.